Now we're going to continue our examination of external CSS by looking a little bit closely at the tag selector. Now we already saw how the tag selector has enabled us to define a few little definitions, few rules for the body itself. Now if I were to just collapse my files window, you'll see the properties for that particular rule, and you'll see how they are affecting it. But let's imagine that we want to do a little something more interesting with this title. Now, as we spoke of in the previous video, most of the elements inside the body are already inheriting some of the properties that we defined in our body. But if I want to now come and click on the new CSS rule definition, and here's our new CSS rule window, we are going to continue by defining another tag or another HTML element. And this time I want to target the h1 tag. Again, we do not have to set a new rule definition, and the reason being is because since we've already defined one externally called style.css, that is exactly where we are going to continue placing all of our other rule definitions. So we don't need a new style sheet. We don't need to put it in this document only in the external style.css. So let's click OK. Then we are confronted with the CSS rule definition for the h1. And as I mentioned, the h1 is already inheriting some of the properties that were defined on the body, specifically the font family of Palatino. But maybe I don't want it to be a serif font. Perhaps I want to change the font to something that's more of a sans serif font. So we could choose, Verdana, Geneva, or Arial Helvetica, among others. Or we could choose something completely different if we wish. But I'm just going to go with, maybe we'll go with Trebuchet. So if I were to apply this, you would already see what that looks like. See how it's changed. Now remember, apply is just like a small little preview. We accept this by clicking OK. So if you like what that looks like, that's great. Now let's talk a little bit about the font size. Now I want this to be a little bit larger than it is right now. So we could come in here and define something that's absolute in a pixel value, but I'm going to choose something like 2, and here I'm going to say ems. Now, as I mentioned in the previous video, we'll be discussing a little bit more about typography and the units of measurement in another video. But for this moment, basically we'll say if 1 em is equal to 16 pixels, well, 2 ems is going to be equal to about 32 pixels. So if I apply that, and you'll see that, well, really not much has in fact changed. What if I was to say something like 3 ems instead? Now you really see some of the power. Now my h1 is looking a lot larger than it did a second ago. It's in a completely different font. This one happens to be a sans serif font, and here is the font stack. It's saying if you don't have Trebuchet MS, give me Arial. If you don't have Arial, give me Helvetica. If you don't have Helvetica, give me any sans serif that happens to be on your system at the moment. What if we wanted to change the color? Perhaps we could come in here and I could choose something that looks a little bit different. So for example, if I wanted to choose something that's more along the lines of a blue, I could come in here and click on this, and lo and behold, we happen to have our blue text changed as well. And that looks great. So I'm just going to click OK and move on. Now we also have some other headlines in here. Notice you'll have a H2, and you also have some other things. Now let me just show you the power of CSS. If this H2 is actually, if I come to the property window and reformat this as a H1, check out what happens. Look at that. It looks just like a H1 now. But I'm going to keep it as a H2 in this case instead. I think I did that on the wrong one, so I'll just come back here, select this one, and say H2. So a H2 then would be a little bit different from what we have. Now, there's a number of different ways that we could do this, but one of the ways would be to actually right-click on the H1, and I could say duplicate this. Now, duplicating this would be saying, well, what do we want to redefine? Well, we already have a H1, so I'm going to say a H2 this case. Again, still in the style.css. And if I click OK, you'll notice that it looks exactly the same. That's really not all that useful. But instead, what I'm going to do is double click on this and open up the rule definition one more time. Now, I could have made the change directly here in the properties, but I'm just going to do it here. Instead of 3, maybe I'll choose something like 2.6 ems. And now you'll notice that that's just a little bit smaller. Perhaps I want it even smaller, so maybe I'll say something like 2.2. Click OK, and you'll see that now it's much smaller. But let's take the opportunity to look at a couple of other things here. For example, the font style would determine whether or not this is going to be italic or just normal or oblique. Now, I'm not really interested in doing that, but I'll do it anyways, just for the sake of illustration. And let's press apply so you can see what it looks like. Ah, yes, italicized text. The font weight, it's already bold because it happens to be a H1, or in this case a H2 tag. However, you can work with font variants, whether or not you want it to be in small caps. I don't. But text transform here allows me to say, listen, let's capitalize every element. Ah, look at that. The lowercase letters, which I left there on purpose, are now capitalized. And if I wanted to, I could say just make the whole thing in uppercase. Wow, look at that. Very easy to do. Or just make it lowercase. It was already lowercase, so. But in this case, I'm just going to say capitalize it. Now the font color is exactly the same, so I'm happy with that, and I'll click OK. And there you go. Now we happen to have some H2s in place. Now if I were to scroll down, you would see there's another headline here, but that's a H3. Now I could duplicate it, but just to show you the differences, right, and just to reinforce what we've done, I'm going to go to the new CSS rule. I'm going to come in here, and we're going to say, let's define this particular tag, the H3, inside of style.css. That's perfectly fine, and we'll click OK. And now our rule definition, I want it to be the same just so we have a level of consistency on this. So I'm going to choose yet again the trebuchet. And this time I'm going to say, well, maybe I only want it to be a lot smaller, H3. So I'll say something like, remember 1 is 16, which is pretty much the size of our paragraph. So I want it to be bigger than a paragraph, but not as big as the other one. So maybe I'll say 1.6 just to see what that looks like. Not pixels, but in this case ems, which is the more relative means of styling this. And I'll just also choose the color. Look at this little cool effect. If I don't remember what exactly which blue color I wanted exactly, I could come in here, I could experiment. I could also go to the system color picker. And if you click on the system color picker, you'll see that this little window opens up, and you could just move the brightness a little bit more this way, and I could come in here and choose green or red or anything else. I'm going to cancel that for the moment because I also want to show you this. You could just click on this and look at the little eyedropper that you've got, and now I could come in here and choose the exact same blue that I had on the other ones. So if I apply this, you'll see, hey, lo and behold, look at what's happened here. Perhaps what I'm going to do is make it a little smaller, maybe 1.2, and I'll text transform it so it's all uppercase. And let's see what that looks like. Pretty cool. Not bad at all. So that just gives you a little bit more of an understanding of how that works. Now here is the power. If we look down here, all of our other H3s, in this case this one right here, looks exactly the same as the one that I defined right here. Pretty neat. Not really a difficult thing to do, but very easy to do. Remember that you can always go back and make changes at any time you want. So for example, if I wanted to change the body, I could come in here and do so, or I could add a property, or you could just double click it, bring up the rule definitions, and for example, maybe I want to make the background a different color from white. I'll go to background color. I'll click on this, and maybe I'll make it a very, very faint gray. Or perhaps I'll even choose a faint gray that happens to have a little bit of blue inside of it. Maybe something more like that. Just a hint of blue. So if I were to click OK, and press apply, you could see exactly what that's done. Now if I don't happen to like that, if I think that, yeah, there's a little too much blue in there and I want to go back closer to the gray that I had a second ago, maybe make that even a little bit brighter, and just click OK, press apply. You can sort of see what we've been doing. And again, if I want to make changes here, I could just come in here and say, you know what, I just want to go with straight gray, no blue or background color there. And here you can also go to the system color picker and just make that even lighter if you wish. There you go. So that's a little bit about working with the very simple styling of tags like H1s and H2s and 3s. When we come back, we'll look more at working with custom classes.